Story number 1. In a quiet neighborhood, an old house stood apart, its blacked-out windows hiding secrets that chilled the air. Lucas, a young HVAC technician, and his crew stepped into its shadow, expecting a routine job, but finding a presence that knew too much. The homeowner, a pale, silent woman, moved like a ghost, her eyes piercing through the darkness of a home that felt alive with malice. She spoke names she shouldn't know, secrets buried in the hearts of strangers, unraveling the crew's courage. When their tools were packed away by unseen hands, Lucas knew the house wanted them gone, but not before it left its mark. The air grew heavy, each creak a whisper of something watching, waiting to reveal more than they could bear. The woman's gaze lingered, her knowledge a violation that shook their souls. Lucas and his team fled, but the house's secrets followed, etched in their minds. Each step away felt like a betrayal, leaving behind a truth they couldn't face. The neighborhood faded, but the memory of her voice, naming the unnameable, clung like a shadow. This was no ordinary job. It was a descent into a place that knew them better than they knew themselves. So, I picked up a job doing HVAC or heating and air installations right after high school. Lucas, fresh out of school, found camaraderie in the work, bonding with his crew over shared exhaustion and a longing for home. I enjoyed the job, too, more so the people that I worked with every day, as we were all pretty like-minded, didn't want to be here, and just wanted to go home to our families, or in my case, my dog. His father's ultimatum had pushed him into the trade. Now, not long after I graduated, my dad gave me an ultimatum: go to school or get a job. Either way, you're not going to live off of me and my house anymore. I knew that it was coming all my life. He'd been saying things like, when you're done with school, you're out of here. Or, you're going to be living like I did, independent and struggling to survive. His father's harsh upbringing shaped his words, a shadow of abandonment Lucas barely understood. My father had a rough life as a kid. His parents abandoned him, leaving him to his grandparents to raise. According to my dad, he would have much rather been left on the street. And that's about as much as he would tell me. Lucas had climbed the ranks quickly, earning a spot on a crew with James, a man wrestling with personal demons. Anyway, it was about a year and a half into my career, and I was learning pretty fast. Climbing the ladder from apprentice to being assigned to a designated crew in no time. I was paired with a guy named James, a good man that struggled with his moral compass, sometimes dealing with a split family and one of his own. The day began routinely, grabbing equipment, joking with colleagues, heading out, the job in question. It started just like every other day. Go to the office, pick up the equipment for the day, chit-chat with the other guys, and then head to the job. The neighborhood was upscale, a contrast to their usual mixed bag. It was a nice neighborhood, which was a relief as the area that we live in is 50-50, whether or not you're going to be jumped or tipped for your work. The house, however, was a blight. The house. It stuck out like a sore thumb, though overgrown grass, decayed roof, destroyed dicker in the yard, cracked concrete in the driveway from tree roots growing under it, trees forming a vegetated tunnel over the driveway, and a detached garage that looked as if it hadn't been touched in like 20 years at least. James muttered, uneasy. James looked at me. Of course, we have to get this one house right. Lucas brushed it off, rationalizing the neglect. Something felt off. I thought, though, maybe their house broke and just cannot afford anything other than the house payments and pulled a loan for this job or whatever. But I wasn't sure, and it didn't matter, to be honest. We were here to do a job and get paid and then just go home anyway. But the windows stopped him cold, blacked out, swallowing all light. Now, something that stood out to me immediately was the windows were completely black. Not a tinted black, but a solid black. No light in or out. James approached the door, but the homeowner barely opened it. I stayed at the truck as James greeted the homeowner. I looked over at him as he knocked on the door, and within seconds, she answered, but wouldn't open the door, but maybe 4 or 5 inches, according to James. He came back to the truck and had an odd look on his face, one of confusion or disgust. I really couldn't tell. She said to meet her around back. The house's design was unusual, with a full-sized basement. He said this home was built in a very heavy grade, meaning the basement was a full size and easily accessible through a normal man door. Lucas grabbed tools, hearing faint music from the garage. As I walked around the corner, I noticed coming from the detached garage that there was music, which meant that maybe somebody was in there working on a car or something. But the basement chilled him, its air thick with mildew and unease. I sat James' tool bag down by the AC unit and I went inside. Immediately, I got a chill down my spine. It felt cold and eerie, and there was a musty mildew smell that just filled up every corner of this basement. James, he had a scrunched up nose and squinted eyes, obviously displaying disgust. The homeowner had vanished upstairs. The homeowner, they just sort of went upstairs as I walked in, as I could hear her going up the steps. The basement was split, a garage area separated from a living space. The basement was separated into 2 parts, though, a garage-type area where I was working with a wall cutting in half from the other side of the door, and a full wall separated the garage area from the living room area. Lucas whispered to James, unsettled. So, I looked over at James as I sat my bag down and asked softly, "Don't you have the creeps about this place, man?" He looked at me and just nodded and went outside. Work began, but the dim light felt oppressive. There was a small fluorescent light that illuminated my workspace, and other than that, it was really dark. I also couldn't see past the light when I turned around, making the backdrop of the light completely black, which also made me feel as if I was sort of in an interrogation room. I guess a spark from a fire jolted Lucas. His focus shattered. I went to cut a high voltage wire and sparks flew and I jumped out of my skin. I could have sworn that I turned off the breakers. How could I have gotten the wires out of the old ones without turning the breaker off after all? I mumbled to myself because I had tripped the breaker too. The one light that I did have had turned off now. He reset the breaker, but froze when he turned back. I sort of shut up and went to reset the main breaker. I flipped the breaker on and the light came back on. And as I turned around, I froze. The homeowner stood there, pale and giggling. The homeowner was right there. And this had been the first time that I had seen her. She was pale, absolutely no color to her skin, around 5 feet tall, in her early 80s maybe, and had wrinkly old skin that folded around her elbows and face like a Shar-Pei. All I could get out was a hi. Her presence was a shock, her eyes dark and unyielding, And I mean, she scared the ever-living heck out of me. She didn't say a word, though she was hunched over a little bit and just sort of looking at me, her eyes almost black. She grinned a little bit and turned away and went back upstairs. Her silent steps unnerved him. She made no sound as she walked, almost as if her feet didn't even touch the ground. Lucas took a break, shaken. It spooked me, and at that, I took a break. I walked up to the van and sat down. James noticed his unease. "Hey, you good, bro?" James asked. Yeah. I gotta meet our customer finally." He just looked at me, eyes widened. "She's weird, isn't she?" he asked. Lucas nodded, rattled. I just raised my eyebrows in acknowledgement at this. They resumed, but Lucas needed help. I went back to work, though, and I got to a point where I needed help with something and called our office to send a tech out to help us wire something up. They ordered food. The house is chill, lingering. So I ordered some food off of DoorDash, as I don't like leaving the job to eat. I hung out with James until food arrived, and we both stopped and we ate. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, but the whole time just something felt off, like something was watching us while we worked. I felt like I could reach out and touch whatever it was, even though I couldn't see it. Arnold, a seasoned tech, had arrived. In any case, our tech arrived about the time that we were finishing eating. His name was Arnold. Arnold was a religious man like myself, too, and we connected on that a little bit. We often talked over the phone or text about things going on in our lives and what we could do to help ourselves with God. He teased them for their nerves. "Hey, what's up, guys? Hey." Didn't ask if I wanted anything to eat. He said, "Hey, we didn't know that you were coming, or we would have." James said Arnold was getting home. He would often use a sort of cliché humor. James stood up and started to brief him on all that we had left to do, and also mentioned our lovely customer as well. He described everything to him, like her appearance, our interactions with her, and the feeling that we got when we go into the house. Arnold shook his head and claimed that we were a couple of chickens and that we were scared of an old lady like this. James shrugged and said, "Okay, well, when you meet her, you'll understand." Inside, the house turned stranger. I went inside to grab something at one point. I think my wallet. I cannot remember, but something like that. And I came out pretty quickly. Arnold looked at James and said, "Well, let's get this done. I've got a couple of other calls after this," but as soon as we stepped inside, something just wasn't right. Their tool bags were neatly packed, untouched by them. James led and looked down at our tool bags, and they were sitting by the door, now perfectly packed and closed. Now, I can assure you that I did not move them, and I certainly wouldn't have put all my tools away as we weren't finished. Lucas felt a chill, as if the house itself was urging them out, and it was then that I concluded that something just did not want us in there, indirectly, telling us to leave by putting everything together for us. Chills ran up my spine. Arnold dismissed it, moving on. But Arnold, he didn't even seem fazed, acting as if we did this to try and freak him out, and he just walked right on past it. Upstairs, the house was a frozen relic. Arnold went up the stairs and called out, "Hey, ma'am, we're going to put your thermostat up." "Okay." There was no reply, but we could hear footsteps upstairs. Lucas followed, paranoia gripping him. I got about halfway up the stairs and I turned around, paranoid, because I just felt like something was behind me. There she was, statue still, her eyes glowing faintly. And I swear to you, at the bottom of the steps, there she was standing there, silent, just standing there, straight and still like a statue. And again, I swear to you that her pupils, they were almost glowing with like a very small white light. A foul smell hit them, sharp and unfamiliar. Then it hit us all. A smell, one that I had never smelled before, but it was so potent. Arnold reached the kitchen, its light buzzing faintly. Arnold gets up to the kitchen and flips the switch on for the kitchen, and a small overhead light over the sink turns on and begins buzzing. "Bapti store," Lucas whispered, pointing to the woman. I tapped James on the shoulder and whispered, "Hey, man, she's at the bottom of the steps." James looked, but saw nothing. His face pale. James' face turns pale. I knew what he was thinking. How long had she been down there? And was she hiding in that room? He leans over my shoulder and sighs. "Bro, no one's there? What are you talking about?" I thought that I just saw her. Lucas turned and she was gone. And I then turned around really fast and he was right. No one was there. I look at him. "Dude, I swear to you that she was right there." Arnold, unaware, addressed her. It was about that time that I said that Arnold also acknowledged someone. "Hey, you must be Miss Brown." She was slouched over like an elderly person and replied with a simple, "Sure." I have honestly never heard anyone reply sure to that before. The windows were sealed with trash bags, explaining the darkness. Now, if you remember, I had mentioned the windows being solid black. Well, it was around about now that I figured out why. They were covered with industrial black trash bags taped around the window sill to lock out any source of light coming in. The smell lingered. The house too clean for its decay. That, although, was still present, too. And I had never smelled anything like it before. The odd thing was that the house was clean, though tables, counters, all clean. Arnold finished, trying to stay professional. Arnold finished up and turns to her and told her, "Well, you're all set up and ready to rock and roll?" Then she spoke, her voice cutting through. She just looked at him. A smile started to grow on her face that felt like it went past her eyes. "How many kids do you have?" she asked. Her voice was strong but high-pitched, like a typical older woman's voice would be. Excuse me," he replied. "Well, there's Ann, Barbara, and Chuck. But there's one more, isn't there?" Her words stunned them. She knew Arnold's children. Arnold was completely shocked and was now wide-eyed and looking at me and James. As far as I knew, he only had 3 kids. And yes, that was their names. But how the heck did she know? She pressed further, naming his unborn child. "Arnold's wife is pregnant. I can feel her. What's her name going to be? Clara?" "That's what your wife picked out." She pointed and bounced her finger at Arnold. She turned to Lucas, her voice a knife. She looked at James, and it was then that he booked it down the stairs. I guess she then slowly looked at me, and I will never forget this till the day that I die. "Marissa." She said 3 times. The name of Lucas's miscarried child pierced him. That was the name of my unborn child that died because of a miscarriage. He wanted to scream, but fear held him. I wanted to scream at her, but I figured that she wanted a reaction out of us, and she kept pushing. Arnold was silent, as I was. We both knew what was going on at this stage. Possession, maybe a witch, who knows? But we knew that we needed to leave. Her posture shifted, her smile unnatural. She never made an advance toward us like she wanted to hurt us. But her posture suddenly changed. She stood up straight, smiling, barely any teeth showing, but the creases of her wrinkly smile almost touched her ears. They fled, terror driving them out. And it was then that I had had enough. I made a break for it, and I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, stumbling once. I sped walk to the work truck where James sat in the driver's seat with both hands on his lap, pale and shaking. I'm sure that I looked the same, to be honest, but I looked over at James and said, "Man, to heck with this. Let's just go." Right. As James put the van into drive, Arnold came running past the truck, got in his van, and also sped off. The drive back was silent, their minds reeling. We started driving away, and I thought to myself, did I get my tools? Was she really possessed? I mean, a million things were running through my mind in about half a second. It was the longest drive back to the office that I've ever had. 2, they didn't collect payment. 2 shaken to care. We didn't collect any money for that job, which was normal procedure. But to be honest, we didn't care. At the office, they reported to their manager, who dismissed their story. The next day, James called for a meeting with our manager and told him everything about the comments that she was making to not collecting the money. Our manager looked at us and just asked, "So, you didn't get collect?" James and I looked at each other, and James asked, "Did you not hear anything else that I just said?" She knew Arnold's kids' names. Man, he laid back in his cushy office chair and just said, "We'll have collections call her and finish it up. Please just collect next time." All right, guys. The incident lingered, unresolved. After that, though, we heard nothing about her, and there was no confirmation that the money was ever collected or anything. James and Lucas remained friends, but Arnold quit soon after. His years of experience no match for the house's weight. James and I, we're still good friends to this day, but Arnold, well, he quit about 3 weeks after this, stating that he just wasn't cut out for this trade anymore. Arnold and I, we'd still talk on occasion, but we never talk about that day. Lucas carried the memory, haunted by her voice, and I still hear her sometimes in my thoughts, or I even have nightmares about her from time to time. The house stood as a dark mark in his mind, a place where secrets spoke louder than reason, a reminder of truths too heavy to name. Story number 2, the mountains rose steep and silent, their peaks scarred by the ghosts of World War I, where battles had carved wounds into the earth. For Eli, hiking these trails with his metal detector was a hunt for history, a way to touch the past. But on this day, in a remote corner of the range, the air turned heavy. The trees whispering secrets they'd held for decades deep in a hidden hollow. Something waited, an object that didn't belong, pulling him toward a mystery that chilled his blood. The trail was treacherous, a narrow path winding through dense forest and jagged rocks, far from any road or village. Eli's detector buzzed faintly, leading him off the beaten track to a spot where the ground dipped, cloaked in moss and tangled roots. He felt it before he saw it, a stillness too deep, as if the mountain was holding its breath. I often go hiking with a metal detector in the mountains near where I live, an area that saw heavy fighting during World War I. The silence was oppressive, broken only by his footsteps, each one echoing like a trespasser's dare. He nearly missed it. A narrow, deep hole, almost invisible beneath the overgrowth, its edges swallowed by the earth. Eli's heart skipped. This wasn't a natural pit, but something carved, deliberate. And one day, I ended up in a really remote, steep section that's difficult to reach on foot, and hidden in the moss and roots, I found a narrow and deep hole, almost invisible unless you were right on top of it. At its bottom, glinting faintly, was a child's bicycle, rusted but intact. And at the bottom of this hole was a small children's bicycle. The sight stopped him cold. Now, there were no paths nearby, no signs of human activity. Just this single bike lying at the bottom of the trench. No child could have reached this place. No parent would have carried a bike so far. Eli's mind raced. How did it get here, in a place so remote, so tied to war's grim past? I immediately feared the worst and climbed down to go and check. But it was nothing else, just this bike. He scrambled down, the hole's walls slick and tight, but found only the bike, its frame twisted, alone. I took a couple of photos, but I've been thinking about this ever since I saw it. Eli climbed out, his hands trembling, the photos on his camera a haunting record of the impossible. I mean, who carries a child's bike all the way up there, and why throw it into a hole that no kid could possibly reach? He reported it to the rangers, hoping for answers, but none came. And while I reported this to a couple of rangers back then, I never heard anything about it. And really, nothing seems to have come from it. The mountain kept it secret, but the bicycle lingered in Eli's mind, a relic of a story untold, tied to the war-torn earth. It still gives me chills. The hike back was silent, the forest's weight pressing harder with each step. Eli couldn't shake the image of the bike, its small frame out of place in a land marked by violence. Was it a remnant of a forgotten tragedy? A child's toy left behind in the chaos of war? Or something else, placed there by hands long gone for reasons no one could know? The mountains held no answers, only shadows that seemed to watch him leave, whispering of secrets buried deeper than the hollow. Story number 3. The quiet streets of a peaceful neighborhood hid a secret under the flickering glow of a streetlight. A man walked home, unaware of the eyes watching from a parked car, its engine silent but its presence alive. A voice called out, calm yet chilling, offering a glimpse of something hidden in the trunk. He knew the walker's name, though no name was shared, and his car never moved. For Lewis, this wasn't just a walk. It was a descent into a mystery that refused to let go. Lewis worked at a small electronics store in a plaza 30 minutes from home. The area wasn't dangerous, but the store closed late, and he sometimes walked home if he missed the bus. He knew it wasn't the smartest choice, but he liked the quiet. One night, walking through a residential area 10 minutes from his apartment, a peaceful place with tree-lined streets and warm porch lights, he passed a dark gray sedan, old but not junky. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man in his late 50s or early 60s, gray-bearded, heavyset, in a delivery uniform with an unfamiliar logo. His demeanor was calm, not threatening, almost too casual. He said, "Hey, can I ask you something real quick?" Lewis stopped but stayed back, saying, "Yeah." The man sneered, saying, "Would you help me with something? I've got something in the trunk you'll like." A gut drop feeling hit Lewis, a warning of wrongness. He froze, asking, "Oh, what is it?" The man tilted his head, smiling too calmly, saying, "It's better if you see it. You seem curious." Lewis's heart raced. The man's calm was unnerving, like a trap waiting to snap shut. He stepped back, mumbling about being in a hurry, and walked away fast, not running, to avoid panic or provocation. The man didn't follow, just watched from the driver's seat. The street felt too quiet, the porch lights too dim, as if the night conspired with him. As Lewis reached the corner, 20 feet away, the man called out, "See you around, Lewis!" In that same calm voice. Lewis hadn't shared his name, making the encounter the strangest in his life. He reported it to the police, who took it seriously, asked questions, and promised to watch for similar reports, but admitted they could do little without more evidence. They urged him to call if it happened again. Lewis checked the area by day, knocking on doors. Few houses were nearby, but one had a doorbell camera, and the owner kindly shared the footage. The incident was just out of frame, though faint conversation was audible, surreal but unclear. Lewis's skin crawled, replaying the man's voice, knowing his name. He decided to walk the route again, not wanting to meet the man but needing to know if he lingered. The choice felt reckless, but the mystery gnawed at him. He returned to the route, expecting the man to be gone. But the same car, same spot, same man sat under a flickering streetlight, as if waiting. The car was untouched, covered in pollen and dust. A smiley face drawn on the trunk, faint from weathering. A dead leaf was stuck in the windshield wiper, and tires sank deeper into the dirt, like the car hadn't moved for weeks. Lewis didn't notice these details before, or they weren't there. He didn't stop, didn't peek, but saw the man watching, calm and expressionless. He vowed never to take that route again, realizing the man might be waiting, doing nothing, just watching. The stillness of the car, its unchanged state, felt like a threat, as if it knew he'd return. Lewis couldn't shake the man's face, his voice, or the car's eerie stillness. It wasn't just a creep, it was wrong, like he didn't belong to the world. He told a coworker, a night shift veteran at the store, who frowned. "That street's got stories," she said. "People see cars that don't move, drivers who know too much." She shared a tale of a delivery man seen years ago, offering to show things in his trunk, vanishing when approached. Lewis pictured the sedan, its dust-covered shell, and wondered if it was the same. He checked online, finding forum posts about a gray watcher in the area, a man in a parked car who knew names, never leaving his spot. No one had answers, only warnings: don't engage, don't look back. Lewis stopped walking home, taking the bus even if it meant waiting. Some nights, he heard a faint engine hum outside his apartment, but saw nothing, yet felt eyes on him. The police followed up, finding no new reports. But a neighbor mentioned an old case, a man in a sedan linked to missing locals, never caught. Lewis keeps his phone ready, dreading the day he hears that calm voice again calling his name from the dark. Story number 4. The hotel's breakfast room buzzed with morning light. but a shadow lingered in its corners. A young woman sipped her coffee, unaware of the stranger watching her from across the room. His gaze wasn't friendly, it was heavy, deliberate, a silent claim on her presence. She offered a polite greeting, but his response carried an edge, a hint of something more than casual conversation. This was no ordinary stranger. He was a threat cloaked in normalcy. And she was his focus. The hotel, a temporary home, suddenly felt like a maze with no safe exit. The phone in her room rang again and again, with no voice on the other end. Each call was a pulse, a reminder that someone knew where she was. She tried to dismiss it, but the air grew thick, the stillness between rings louder than any sound. The hallway outside her door, once mundane, now held a presence, waiting just beyond her sight. Who was calling, and how close were they? The walls of the hotel seemed to close in, their neutrality a lie, hiding danger. A storm rolled in, the sky dark with intent. Lightning flashed, illuminating the lobby where she stood with her colleagues, but the darkness outside mirrored the unease within. A tap at her door came late, uninvited, a challenge to her safety. She opened it a crack, and there he was, his words twisting her casual politeness into an obligation. Why wouldn't he leave? And what did he want in the dead of night? The hotel, meant for rest, was now a stage for a quiet terror. The hallway became a battleground, its shadows alive with his presence. She saw him through the peephole, lurking, listening, his movements calculated, predatory. Her heart raced. The phone call to her mother a lifeline as fear took hold. He hid in the alcove, thinking himself unseen, but she knew. His eyes were on her door, waiting for a chance. Could she stay safe behind a locked door? Or was he already too close? The storm outside raged, but the real threat was inside, inches from her room. Escape came, but the fear lingered. The hotel moved her to a new room. The stranger warned to stay away, but trust was broken. The shadow in the hallway had marked her, a reminder that danger could wear a familiar face. She left, but the memory of his gaze followed, a lesson in caution carved into her soul. Some encounters don't end when you walk away. They stay, watching from the edges of your life. In 2010, Emily, 22, worked for a traveling photography group taking church directory photos, staying at a hotel in Harlem, Illinois, with 3 other photographers, 2 guys and a girl. One morning, she went to breakfast, watching TV in the hotel's breakfast area, when a guy she didn't recognize caught her eye. She said, "Good morning," as she always did to be friendly, and he said it back, mentioning he was there with his construction team. They had a polite exchange, and as she left, she said, "Have a good one. See you later." To which he replied they could hang later. She brushed it off with, "Yeah, maybe," not thinking much of it. Her work started at 11 a.m. and ran to 10 p.m., so she took a nap in her room, having slept poorly while resting. Her room phone kept ringing with no one answering when she picked up. Unsettled, she took the receiver off to stop the ringing. Leaving for work, she saw the guy in the hall, waved casually, and said she was going to work when he asked. She rode with her female colleague to the church, sharing about the strange phone calls, and learned her colleague got them too. That night, a thunderstorm hit with lightning and tornado risks. So the group watched from the hotel lobby door, staying connected. Back in her room, a tap on her door startled her. She cracked it open to see the guy who referenced her earlier comment about hanging out. She said she was too tired and needed sleep, then shut the door later. He tapped again, but she didn't answer, pretending to be out or asleep. While talking to her mom on the phone, she admitted being a little scared. A weird feeling made her whisper, "Mom, hold on, I need to check something," and tiptoed to the peephole, seeing him listening at her door. He moved to the hallway's indentation, leaning out as if hiding. Her heart raced as she whispered to her mom about her fear and called the front desk to complain. Her colleague also reported the calls. The hotel gave them new rooms, and the construction manager was told to keep the guy away. Emily shared the situation with church members who offered their homes, but she didn't trust anyone then. She never saw him again and was jealous her friend got a hot tub in her new room. The experience left her wary, more careful about who she talked to and what she said. The shadow in the hallway, a lingering reminder of how quickly safety could unravel. Years later, Emily carried the memory like a weight. The hotel, meant to be a temporary haven, had become a place of dread, its hallways hiding threats behind polite smiles. The stranger's persistence, his calls, his lurking wasn't just harassment. It was a violation, a reminder that danger could follow a simple "good morning." The storm had passed, but the fear stayed, teaching her to guard her words, her trust. The shadow in the hallway was gone, but its echo lingered, a caution that some strangers leave marks that never fade. Story number 5. The yoga studio hummed with quiet energy, its fluorescent lights casting stark shadows on the polished floor. Maya stretched on her mat, her body fluid but tense, aware of the woman beside her. So, there's this woman that I know, Paula. She's maybe 4 cents to Papuitit, originally from a country in South America somewhere, and freakishly strong. Paula was a force, small, wiry, her strength almost unnatural, defying her age. I used to take yoga with her, and we did aerials and pole together. She moved with a precision that felt too perfect, too intense. Her presence a riddle Maya couldn't solve. She's also nearing 60, but you'd never guess it. She's so fit and tiny, almost ageless in this intense sort of wiry and even vibrant way. The air shifted, heavy, with an unspoken weight, but I've never quite known what to make of her, really. I wouldn't say that we were close, though Maya felt it, a distance, a barrier, despite their shared hours in the studio. For a little while, we started to get closer because we were around each other a lot, but closeness brought unease, a creeping sense that Paula was watching too closely. The thing is, though, is that she started subtly sort of mirroring me, doing her hair like mine, painting her nails the same color, styling herself in ways that felt oddly specific. It wasn't admiration, it was mimicry, precise and deliberate, like a shadow trying to wear her skin. The studio's bright lights did nothing to ease the chill. She even bought me some clothes, and it didn't feel like a sweet gesture. It felt off, like she wasn't admiring me. She was trying to wear me, or maybe even be me. The clothes sat unworn in Maya's closet, their presence a quiet accusation. And then one day we were at an open poll together with one other person there. The room felt too large, too empty. The third person, a ghost in the background. The studio doesn't have dim lighting. It's actually bright and fluorescent, yet the light seemed to falter, pooling around Paula as she moved. Maya felt eyes on her, sharp and unyielding. She was doing a sideways pulsate, and I could feel her watching me. Paula's gaze was a weight, pinning Maya as she stretched. We are both extremely flexible, but I have a connective tissue disorder, so I have a slight edge on her, which isn't a big deal to me, but she is extremely competitive, probably even a covert narcissist. Her competitiveness was a blade, cutting through the studio's calm. But anyways, I had just done something kind of splitty, and I turned around to smile at her because it felt like she was looking at me. Maya turned, her smile faltering as their eyes met, and when I did, I swear to you that her eyes were completely black. The world stopped, the studio's hum fading to silence. I mean, fully black. I looked for several seconds because I couldn't look away. But she seemed vacant, not checked out, but absent. Like she'd gone somewhere momentarily and she was temporarily checked out. Paula's face was a mask, her eyes voids, not human but something else, something watching. But yet, it also felt like there was something in her place, like an energetic placeholder. It wasn't Paula, it was a presence. Hollow, yet alive, staring through her. Something also seemed to be looking out through her, but it wasn't necessarily an intelligent being. Maya's heart pounded, her skin prickling with the certainty that she'd seen something forbidden. The moment broke, but the unease lingered. I was left with this feeling of, I don't think that I was supposed to see that. Maya stumbled to the table, her hands trembling as she reached for her water bottle. And I'm pretty sure she doesn't know that I saw this. Paula resumed her movements, oblivious, or perhaps unaware of the thing that had taken her place. But also, I don't know if she was even aware of something happening. To be honest, the studio felt wrong now. Its bright lights mocking the darkness she'd glimpsed. It's like when you accidentally see a mic in a movie, or a crew wearing jeans in a film set in ancient Rome or something. It was a glitch, a tear in reality. Undeniable. The lights held no comfort. It wasn't a weird lighting thing either. Again, bright fluorescent lights at the studio, or a blink or anything. Maya's mind raced, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the eye, but it was too real. It was unmistakable, and I have never seen anything like it before or since then. She avoided Paula's gaze, her heart still racing. I'm also pretty positive that nobody else saw it but me. It only lasted a few moments. The third person in the studio was oblivious, lost in their own routine. I finally stopped looking at her and walked over to the table where my stuff was and took a sip, and then everything was back to normal. But normal was a lie. The air had changed, heavy with something unspoken. Maya stopped attending classes with Paula, but the memory clung to her. And look, I know how it sounds. I tried to rationalize it too, gaslight myself into letting it go. She told herself it was stress, imagination, anything but the truth. But I just cannot do that. Not with everything else. The mirroring, the vibe, the way that I never felt entirely at ease around her. Paula's mimicry, her intensity, now felt like a warning, a prelude to that moment. Maya moved to a new studio, but the unease followed, a shadow in her peripheral vision. At night, she'd wake to a faint rustling, like fabric being adjusted as if someone was trying on her clothes. She checked her closet, found the gifted clothes untouched, but their presence felt heavier, wrong. She sought answers, speaking to a friend who knew folklore. The friend spoke of entities that wore human forms, not to live but to consume, to become. Stories from South America whispered of beings that latched onto the living, mirroring their essence to draw closer. An old journal found online described a woman in a village whose eyes turned black during a ritual, her body a vessel for something older. Maya's stomach churned. Had Paula been a vessel? A doorway? Her dreams grew vivid, filled with black eyes watching from mirrors, from corners. All was silent, but present. The signs grew bolder. Maya began to notice small changes. Her nail polish chipped in patterns matching Paula's. Her hair tangled in ways it hadn't before. She avoided mirrors, kept lights on, but the air in her apartment grew heavy, oppressive. One night, she found a faint mark on her yoga mat, a smudge like a fingerprint, too small to be hers. She contacted a spiritualist, an elder named Sophia, who knew the old ways. Sophia's face darkened as she listened. Some things don't just watch, they take. Piece by piece, she said. You saw it, and it saw you. It's trying to fit into your life. Sophia offered a ritual, salt, sage, a mirror to trap the presence. But it meant confronting Paula. Facing those eyes again? Maya hesitated, the memory of that black gaze too raw. But the signs grew worse. Her clothes shifted in the closet, arranged in ways she hadn't left them. She tried the ritual alone, scattering salt around her home. But the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. One night, she woke to a figure at her door, small and wiry, its eyes black voids, watching. She didn't move, didn't speak, until dawn broke the spell. The mimic was hers now, a shadow she couldn't escape. Story number 6. The old 3-story house sat on the edge of a quiet wood, its weathered walls hiding a patchwork of apartments carved from its bones for Sophie, a 2-year-old finally free from a toxic housemate. It was a sanctuary, a place to breathe after a year of chaos. The apartment was modest, its wooden door flimsy, but the solitude was worth every creak. She settled in, savoring the peace, unaware that the calm was a fragile illusion, soon to be shattered by a neighbor's rage. The house was a community of sorts, its residents mostly homeowners who welcomed Sophie with open arms. They'd gather in the garden, sipping lemonade under the summer sun, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves from the nearby forest. Sophie felt at home, her days filled with quiet joy, the occasional bear citing a minor thrill in their secluded haven. But beneath the warmth, a shadow waited, one that wore a human face and carried a grudge older than Sophie herself. A month in, the peace broke. An aggressive knock rattled Sophie's door, the wood trembling under the force. She opened it to find her downstairs neighbor, a woman in her 50s with a scowl that cut like a blade, accusing Sophie of flooding her ceiling. The woman's voice was sharp, her eyes blazing with an anger that felt personal, disproportionate. Sophie promised to call the landlord, but the woman stormed off, unsatisfied, leaving a chill in the air that lingered long after. The landlord, off on a long vacation, brushed off the issue, leaving Sophie to navigate the problem alone. Her kind neighbors next door offered their shower, and nothing in return, their generosity a lifeline. Sophie repaid them with handmade gifts. Her heart warmed by their kindness. But when they left for a work trip, Sophie faced a choice: go without a proper shower or risk using her own. The need for cleanliness won, a decision that would plunge her into a nightmare. She stepped into her bathroom, headphones on, a podcast drowning out the world. The water was warm, the moment blissful, until the door exploded inward, wood splintering as the neighbor burst in, screaming like a banshee. Sophie's heart stopped. Her body exploded, her mind reeling as the woman's accusations filled the air. Terror gripped her, the violation raw and immediate. The safety of her home shattered in an instant by a stranger's wrath. I was 21 at the time, and it was the first time that I'd rented a place of my own. After spending a year with a horrendously bad housemate who changed 180 degrees after a month of living together, I was genuinely happy to finally be alone. Sophie had craved solitude, and this apartment, however simple, was her escape. It wasn't a super good apartment or anything, but I was just so happy that I had finally gotten away from that housemate that it didn't even matter to me. It was a huge old 3-story house that got split up into multiple apartments years ago. And most of the people living there were homeowners besides me and another guy who was renting a flat on the first floor. The neighbors' warmth had been a balm. Their garden chats a daily ritual. All of the neighbors, they were super friendly, and we got along just fine. Sometimes spending hours out in the garden with them just chatting or drinking some lemonade, as it was super hot that summer, despite being quite far from the busy city. But trouble came swiftly. Anyway, about 1 month later, the neighbor below me, female and around 50, knocked very aggressively on my door, which was wooden with a wooden frame. Her accusations about a water damage were fierce, her tone venomous. But she told me in a quite aggressive way that there was some water on her ceiling right below my bathtub. I told her that I would call the landlord and tell him about it so that he could get someone to come out and check it out. The landlord's indifference left Sophie stranded. The landlord didn't really care either, as he'd actually got a 2-month-long vacation out of the country and told me that he would get someone to come out. But he didn't. Her kind neighbors stepped in, offering their bathroom. I thankfully had some amazing neighbors, though living next to me, who let me shower at their place without even paying them or anything. Sophie repaid them with art, her gratitude deep. I made them some handmade stuff and digital drawings of their dogs as some sort of payment, because I felt so bad for not being allowed to actually give them a fee for letting me do that. But their absence forced her to act. 2 weeks go by, though, and my awesome neighbors tell me that they have to go away for work for a few days and apologize for not being able to help me until they can get back, which honestly was super sweet of them, but totally unnecessary. Desperate to feel clean, Sophie risked a quick shower. I decided to heck with it in the end. I'll get in the shower really quick so that I can just wash my hair, as the sink was too small to do so, like an A4 paper size. She slipped on her headphones, lost in a podcast. Back then, I had the habit of getting into the shower with my headphones on and just listening to podcasts. But peace turned to panic as the neighbor stormed in, and once I was almost done rinsing off, my absolute psycho of a neighbor bashes my bathroom door open, then starts yelling at me like a maniac. Sophie's world collapsed. Her privacy violated. I was absolutely terrified as I didn't even register it being her at that time, as it all happened so quickly. I got out of the shower as fast as I could and called my landlord sobbing, while this maniac Karen was going to get her phone and call the police or something. The neighbor's rage was unrelenting, her accusations wild. She kept yelling that I was flooding her newly renovated apartment. I was shaking like a blob of jello caught in a tornado by this point. She'd broken the door's frame to get in. This psychotic woman actually kicked my door so hard that it broke the wooden frame right by the lock. And that's how she got in. The situation escalated when the neighbor's husband, a cop, brought 2 colleagues to intimidate Sophie. This woman was married to a cop, just as insane as she was, and she actually convinced him to get 2 of his cop buddies to come and threaten me for damaging their apartment and not fixing whatever was wrong. The water damage was minor, a fault of the landlord's negligence. This crazy Karen sent a video to the landlord, and I kid you not, there was just some small drops of water dripping from the ceiling whenever I showered for longer than 10 minutes, as the landlord had left the floor under the bathtub with no tiles, just plain concrete, which allowed the water to seep through once in a while. Sophie, in shock, didn't call the police, fearing the husband's influence. Being still in shock from being barged in on like this and seen by a stranger butt naked, I didn't call the police straight away. She showed the officers her texts with the landlord, proving her efforts. I gave them my ID, though, and told them that I had talked to the landlord, and also gave them his phone number to go and check. I showed them proof of text between me and the landlord as well. They left with a warning, the neighbor smug with victory. But by that point, I could tell that they sort of started to whisper between them, and that they left after giving me a warning. An upstairs neighbor revealed the truth. The woman's vendetta stemmed from a 15-year-old feud with the landlord. I later found out from my upstairs neighbor, which was the longest staying resident of that house, that she actually had some beef with my landlord like 15 years ago. And that's why she did what she did to me. She tormented every renter to spite him. She couldn't stand anyone who moved into that apartment just because she got into a fight with the landlord years ago and tried to make every renter's life a living hell. Sophie moved out within a week, her savings covering a new deposit. I was lucky enough to find another place to stay in, like less than a week, and had enough money saved up for a deposit as well. The trauma lingered, nightmares plaguing her, her fear of unseen intruders changing her habits. I had horrible nightmares for months to follow, and I still get them occasionally. I cannot wear headphones properly to this day, and I have to have one ear out, as I'm still paranoid that someone's going to break in and I won't be able to hear them and react in a timely manner. The house, once a haven, became a symbol of violation. The neighbor's wrath, a wound that didn't heal. Sophie carried the fear forward, her trust in quiet spaces broken, her new home a fortress where she listened for every sound, waiting for a threat that might never come but felt all too real. Story number 7. The forest swallowed the night, its trees a wall of shadows that pressed against the campus's edge. Clara and James barely acquaintances, ventured into the dark, their footsteps crunching on a path they thought they knew. The air was thick, the silence heavier than it should be, as if the woods were holding their breath. A sudden scream, sharp, inhuman, like a woman's cry, twisted with animal rage, tore through the stillness, freezing Clara's blood. Something was out there, and it was closer than they could bear to imagine. The trail wound deeper, its familiar turns betraying them, leading nowhere. Clara's heart raced as the scream echoed again at puh! Closer, its edge a mix of beast and nightmare. The forest felt alive, its branches clawing at their clothes, its darkness hiding eyes that watched their every step. They were lost, not just in the woods, but in a place where the rules of the world no longer applied, and something was stalking them, waiting for them to falter. They stumbled into a meadow, the open space a false promise of safety. The scream came again, now just beyond the tree line, a sound that clawed at their sanity, part pig, part bird, part human, all terror. Clara grabbed James, her fear overriding their awkwardness, her body trembling as the woods seemed to close in. The night was a predator, and they were its prey, caught in a game they didn't understand, with no way out. The trees rustled, a branch snapped, and the scream erupted right behind them, so close it felt like it could touch them. Clara's mind screamed to run, but her legs were heavy, rooted by the terror of what might be chasing them. The forest was no longer a place of adventure, but a labyrinth, designed to trap them with whatever hunted in the dark. They had to move, to find a way out, before the thing in the woods claimed them. James's phone flickered, its weak light useless against the night's grip. Clara flipped hers open and shut, a desperate signal to ward off the unseen. The leaves crunched behind them, deliberate, moving side to side, as if something circled, testing their resolve. Another scream, right at their heels, sent them running, hearts pounding, until they burst onto a familiar meadow, the road to campus within reach. The woods let them go. But the scream lingered, a warning they'd never forget. Clara and James were new friends, brought together by a group that loved the woods. Our group of friends loved to take walks in the woods. Our campus was surrounded by forest. Night walks were their ritual, a natural escape. We were very comfortable in the woods at night. It just felt like a perfectly natural thing to do, really. But tonight, their group dwindled, leaving just them, eventually. The last one, besides my future husband and I, dropped out. But knowing that him and I didn't really know each other that well, that last friend told us that we should go on the walk together anyways. They ventured out, awkward but eager, so we headed out into the woods, just being acquaintances, and decided to walk down the path that would take us to a place called the altar site. The altar site, marked by a log, was their goal, but the dark misled them. Unfortunately, in the dark, we didn't know this path as well as we thought we did, and we realized that we were getting lost. They joked about survival. We joked about having to spend the night out there and said, "I hope you aren't afraid of survival cuddling." After circling, they chose a straight line through the woods. So we then decided that we would just try and pick a line and start walking as straight through the woods as we could. The terrain was brutal. Trees, rivers, swamps. We walked into trees, rivers, swamp swamps at one point, and just kept going for another hour or so until stumbled out onto what seemed like a larger trail than what we had been on. Hope surged as they followed the trail. At this point, we started following the trail, hoping that it was a main trail and we would use it to find our way out. Clara was optimistic. I remember jumping out onto it, smiling and saying, "We're going to be okay. This will surely get us out." But the trail vanished in a meadow. We followed it out onto a small meadow where we unfortunately lost sight of the trail again. Crossing to the other side, they found no path. Hoping that we could see it again in the woods on the other side, we walked across the meadow and entered the tree line on the other side, only to realize that the trail had now completely disappeared. A scream shattered the night, close and terrifying. We suddenly heard a loud and crisp, bloody scream in the woods nearby. The sound can only be explained as sort of a pig-bird woman screaming bloody murder. Clara questioned it, shaken. We stood there for a second, and then I asked, "What was that?" Future husband said, "I don't know." They retreated to the meadow, and so I suggested that we head back into the meadow where we could at least kind of see things. The dread was palpable. It was a truly dreadful feeling knowing that we weren't alone out there, but had no idea how to get away from it. A branch snapped, a tree shook, and another scream erupted. Closer. And it was then that I heard a thick branch on the ground in the tree line near us snap, and a thick bushy tree near it started to shake like something moved in it. Right after that, there was a sudden scream again. Clara clung to James, terrified. This scream lasted for what felt like 15 seconds, definitely longer than the first one. And I remember suddenly hugging this acquaintance that I was walking with out of fear. He later admitted it was a moment of connection. He told me years later that if he hadn't have been scared out of his wits, that hug would have been very enjoyable. They spotted a new trail and moved, Clara using her phone to signal. And I remember turning and looking behind us and making out what looked like it could have been a trail curving around the bend. We had brought our terrible flip phones with us, hoping to use them as flashlights. Leaves crunched behind them, moving side to side. I kept hearing leaves on one side getting stepped on. Then silence. And then leaves on the other side of the trail, crunching. A final scream drove them to run. That was when we heard the scream one more time. And this time, it was right behind us. We both started running. They reached a familiar meadow, escaping to the road. It was only about 20 more paces, and suddenly we were out of the woods and in a large meadow that we both realized that we recognized. The scream echoed one last time, but nothing followed. But we did hear the thing scream one more time from the tree line, back at the dorms. Clara researched, finding no matching animal sounds. I tried looking up what it might have been that night with my headphones on in the dark room while my roommate slept. It became a campus legend, dubbed a banshee. We told our friends about it in the morning, and it became an instant campus urban legend. People called it the banshee in the woods. A friend later identified it as a cougar. He said, "I know exactly what you heard. That's a cougar." Clara confirmed cougar sightings, aligning with their encounter. Sure enough, I was able to track down people who had seen the cat about a half a year after our encounter, with no sightings in between, and also some articles about sightings from around a year after our incident. The realization they were stalked chilled them, and knowing that we were stalked by a cougar at night like that, well, that is a pretty terrifying thing to know. The woods remained a place of fear, but that night forged a bond that became their future. Story number 8. The Walmart's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over aisles that felt too quiet for comfort. Emily, a 21-year-old college student, navigated the store with her boyfriend, Mark, a towering 4-year-old who made her feel untouchable. Their errands were a ritual, a shared routine that kept fear at bay until tonight. As they entered the sprawling superstore, the evening air carried a subtle chill. The parking lot half empty under a fading sky. Emily's confidence wavered. A flicker of unease she couldn't place, as if unseen eyes were already tracking her steps. In this mundane place, danger was about to unfold, silent and calculated. Mark's stomach churned from their Olive Garden dinner, forcing a quick detour to the restroom. He told Emily he was going to use the restroom quickly and would meet her wherever she said she'd be in the store. She told him she'd be in the candle aisle and went on her way. The candle aisle, lined with flickering scents, was Emily's haven. But tonight it felt exposed. She browsed, her fingers tracing glass jars, unaware of the man in a red shirt who lingered at the aisle's end. His gaze, a slow, predatory scan, pierced her, sending a shiver down her spine. He passed, giving her a creepy up-and-down glance that she felt in her soul. But she didn't think much of it as he continued walking. Emily turned to the shelves, but the man reappeared, too close, pretending to inspect candles while texting furiously. He stood a little too close, pretending to look at items while texting, keeping unashamed eye contact. Having looped back to her aisle, her pulse quickened. She wasn't imagining this. She fled to the electronics section, hoping distance would shake him, but he wasn't alone. 3 others joined him, 2 in navy blue shirts, 1 in gray. Their movements synchronized. Their eyes were locked on her. They followed her to the electronics, pretending to look at home speakers while watching her, texting without being to each other. The silence between them was unnatural, a coordinated dance that screamed intent. Emily's fear spiked as the men shadowed her, their texting relentless, their glances cold and deliberate. She felt trapped in the vast store, its aisles a maze with no safe exit. She went to a store associate, lying about interest in something in the case, to stay close until Mark returned. She chatted about a lava lamp, her voice shaky, her eyes darting to the men still lingering nearby. When Mark texted that he was in the candle aisle, she thanked the employee and beelined to him, pointing to the group and saying, "I think these guys have been following me." Mark, used to her true crime-fueled suspicions, brushed it off, saying, "Let's just get what we need and get out of here." But Emily's gut screamed that this was no overreaction. These men were hunting her. At the self-checkout, near the battery display, danger closed in. The man in the gray shirt moved with alarming speed, crossing the massive store in seconds. He speed-walked from electronics straight toward her, texting like a madman. Emily's heart pounded, her breath shallow as he positioned himself behind her in line, so close she could feel his presence. He got behind her in line, so close that her elbow would have hit him if she moved. She nudged Mark, who locked eyes with the man, pulling her in front of him protectively. Once the man noticed she wasn't alone, he left the line. Suddenly, interested, in the Battery kiosk. The threat retreated, but Emily's skin still crawled, the air thick with unspoken menace. They hurried to their car, Emily's eyes scanning the parking lot. The man in gray, followed by the one in red, emerged empty-handed, their gazes sweeping the lot, still texting. They made their way into the parking lot without purchases, visibly scanning and texting furiously. Emily's blood ran cold. She lived near highways leading to major airports, a hub for trafficking. She thought that's what these men had in mind for her, as trafficking was common in her area near highways to Atil and CLT. The drive home was silent, Mark's hand on hers, but the fear lingered, a shadow that followed them from the store. Emily reported the incident to Walmart, but no cameras caught clear faces, only figures moving in sync. She avoided shopping alone now. Her trust in public spaces shattered, the silent stalkers a haunting reminder of how close she'd come to danger. Story number 9. The streets of Hong Kong buzzed with life. A chaotic symphony of voices and lights. But for Lily, 20 and far from home, the city felt like a labyrinth. She was with her father and brother, weaving through the crudes after a long day at the immigration office. Hunger gnawed at them, and the need for a bathroom was urgent. They stepped off a bus, the neon glow of a McDonald's promising relief. But as Lily climbed the stairs, the air shifted, a subtle wrongness creeping into her pulse. She didn't know it yet, but she was walking into a trap. The McDonald's was loud, packed with chatter and the clatter of trays, but Lily's focus was singular. She needed a toilet, fast. Her brother pointed her upstairs, and she hurried up, expecting a typical fast food restroom. Instead, she found a worker staring at her, his eyes sharp, one drifting lazily to the gut. His voice was flat, directing her to a brown door, unmarked and heavy. Lily hesitated, her instincts prickling, but the urgency in her bladder pushed her forward. The door loomed. A silent warning she ignored. She pushed it open, and the world changed. The noise of the restaurant vanished, swallowed by a soundproof void. The hallway beyond was dark, its walls peeling, lit by a sickly white glow that barely reached the corners. Multiple doors lined the passage, all locked, their handles rusted. It wasn't a staff area, not a mall. It was something else, something abandoned, something wrong. Lily's heart thudded, her steps echoing in the silence, each one screaming for her to turn back. She followed the worker's instructions, turning a corner to find a lift, its doors dull and scratched. The worker appeared behind her, a black bin bag in his hand, nearly empty, his presence too close. He stepped into the lift with her, his lazy eye glinting, and pressed the button for the second floor. "You're very pretty," he said in Cantonese, his voice low, cutting through the quiet. Lily's skin crawled. Her polite thank you, a reflex to avoid trouble. The lift hummed, but the air was heavy, her body screaming danger. The doors opened, not to a bustling mall, but to a maze of narrow, dark hallways, lined with locked doors and endless corners. No lights, no people, just silence and decay. The worker gestured her out, his hand lingering too long, his eyes too fixed. Lily's fight or flight kicked in, her mind racing for an escape. She mumbled an excuse, slipping away. But the hallway stretched on, a nightmare of dead ends and shadows. each step pulling her deeper into the unknown. Lily was in Hong Kong with her brother and father. At the immigration department, she was 20, female, and not a Hong Kong local. It was late, and her dad suggested they take the bus back to eat near their apartment. Midway, her brother suggested they get off to find food. Lily desperately needed the toilet, so her brother pointed to the closest McDonald's. Her brother and dad waited downstairs. She assumed there'd be a toilet upstairs. She walked up, pacing, needing to pee. A worker noticed her, looking at her as if expecting her to bother him. She asked if there was a toilet nearby, and he said, "Toilet? Up through the door, turn left, take a lift." The door he pointed to was an ominous brown door with no signs. Lily opened it, finding a dark, run-down hallway, completely different from the modern McDonald's. Extremely quiet, soundproofed when the door closed. The room was dark, with minimal white light and barely any sound, with multiple locked doors. She thought it might be a staff room. Turning the corner, she found a lift. The worker entered the lift with her, holding a black bin bag with little in it. She asked what floor to press, and he pressed the second floor. He said, "You're very pretty," in Cantonese. Lily mumbled a thank you, uneasy. The lift stopped, opening to a dark, run-down, narrow hallway of doors, like an abandoned apartment or office building, with no one else there. Lily's body tensed. The worker gestured her to get off and seemed to want to walk her to the toilet. She made an excuse, saying, "I've bothered you enough. Just point the direction." He pointed right, saying the toilet was there. She went the opposite way, stalling. The place was a maze, narrow hallways with locked doors. She pushed one, but it was locked. Her brother called, angry, asking why she was taking so long. She explained she didn't know where she was, trying to find her way back. The place was huge, like an abandoned office or apartment, dark, with no signs. The walls were torn down, quiet, and run down, with no functioning toilet. Panicking, she calmed herself with breathing exercises, retraced her steps, found the lift, and pressed down, hitting the close button repeatedly. She walked forward instead of right, finding more doors facing a large glass panel wall. She could see the McDonald's, but people didn't notice her. The glass was a double mirror from the McDonald's side. She turned right, returning to the McDonald's. Her dad asked if she was okay. As she looked pale, she said she'd tell him outside. She asked if he saw the worker with the mask and lazy eye, but he didn't. Her dad said, "Don't tell me you went through that lift. I opened that door. It's terrifying. So many doors in that glass." He'd left, thinking she was elsewhere. Lily's heart didn't stop racing until they were far from the McDonald's. She told her father and brother everything: the worker, the lift, the maze, the mirror. Her father, a burly man rarely shaken, admitted the hallway had unnerved him, its silence and decay unlike anything he'd seen. Her brother, usually skeptical, grew quiet, his eyes darting as if expecting the worker to appear. They didn't eat at the McDonald's, choosing a dinner instead. The neon lights no longer comforting. Back at their apartment, Lily couldn't sleep, the worker's lazy eye and low voice replaying in her mind. She researched the building, digging through forums and local sites. The McDonald's was part of an older complex, its upper floors a mix of abandoned offices and apartments, left to rot after a failed renovation. Some posts mentioned odd encounters, workers who vanished, hallways that led nowhere. One claimed the building was wrong, a place where people got lost, though no one explained why. Lily's unease grew. She wondered about the worker. Was he really staff or something else? His bin bag, nearly empty, felt like a prop, his words a lure. She checked the McDonald's reviews, finding vague complaints about creepy staff and weird upstairs. Nothing concrete, but enough to make her skin crawl. Her father suggested reporting it, but what could she say? A worker led her to a strange place? She had no proof, no day, just a memory that felt like a trap. The next day, they passed the McDonald's again, but Lily refused to go in. The brown door was there, unmarked, its presence heavy. Her brother noticed it too, his usual bravado gone. They never returned, sticking to other restaurants. But the experience lingered. Lily would wake at night, checking her door, fearing that hallway had followed her. She'd see the worker's eye, hear his voice, and wonder what waited in that maze. Months later, a friend in Hong Kong mentioned a news story, an abandoned building near a McDonald's, sealed off after reports of missing people. Lily's heart sank. The memory of the maze flooding back. She didn't read the article. She didn't need to. That door, that lift, that hallway, they were real. And they'd seen her. Lily carried the fear, a weight she couldn't shake. She avoided public restrooms, stayed close to her family in crowds. The McDonald's was just a building, but it had changed her, taught her that danger could hide behind a familiar logo, a worker's smile, a brown door. Some places aren't what they seem. Some doors lead to nowhere. Lily learned that in a McDonald's in Hong Kong, where a maze waited and a worker's gaze was a warning she'd never forget. Story number 10. The forest stretched endlessly around the isolated house, its darkness a cloak that hid secrets. Ethan, barely 7, stood on the dirt road, the full moon casting jagged shadows. A faint hum rose from the ground, not a sound but a vibration, as if the earth itself was whispering his name. He walked toward the cemetery, a place he loved for its quiet paths. But tonight, the air was wrong, too heavy, too still. The moonlight dimmed, and a figure appeared. Tall and thin, its porcelain mask glowing faintly, its smile too wide, too fixed. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. The figure waved, its slender arm moving like a puppet's, then vanished behind a trash bin. The ground trembled again, a subtle pulse, as if the cemetery was waking. Aware of his presence, another figure emerged, smaller, its mask frowning, its movements jerky, deliberate. It peeked from a tree, then another, closer each time. The hum grew louder, urging Ethan to follow, to play their game. The masks weren't just objects. They were alive, their porcelain faces hiding something ancient, something that knew Ethan's steps, his fears, and wanted him to stay in the dark. When I was around 7, we moved to a house pretty much in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place that it was forest for like miles. Your neighbors were far enough away that they probably wouldn't hear you scream in the night. The dirt roads, unpaved until Ethan was older, led to no stores or streetlights, with the nearest town 15-20 minutes away. And all the roads were made of dirt until I was a teenager, and some of them got paved. There were no streetlights, no stores, and you had to drive 15 to 20 minutes in any direction to get to any town. Ethan, drawn to adventure, walked the roads at night under full moons. Now, as I got a little bit older, I would start going out to adventure on the roads at night, especially on nights where the moon was full so I could see better. He frequented 2 nearby cemeteries or the river beyond a hill. I would walk to the nearby cemeteries just to walk around a bit. There were 2 just down the street from here, or down to the river if I wanted to climb down the big hill past those and splash around on the shore a bit. One night, at his favorite cemetery with a paved loop, a tall figure in a black suit and top hat appeared, its porcelain mask smiling. One night in particular, I walked down to the cemetery that I usually preferred over the other, as the path inside was newly paved. But as I came close, a tall, thin figure in a black suit popped up playfully from behind one of the trash cans on the road by the opening. This figure had to be at least 6 feet tall, stomach coming to about the level with one of those tall green trash bins. His outfit was all black, but I could tell that he was wearing a very tailored suit. On his head was a tall top hat and a white porcelain mask adorned with a big smile. It waved, then hid. It didn't move, and I didn't move. But then it lifted a long, slender arm and waved at me before popping back behind the bin. Ethan felt no threat, but fear took over. At that moment, I didn't feel threatened. Oddly enough, it almost felt like it wanted to play a game with me, but I was in no way interested, as you can imagine. He backed away, then ran home, and I was just too freaked out to turn around and leave. So, in the end, I began to walk backwards. I kept my eyes on the trash bin until I couldn't see it anymore before turning and running the rest of the way back to my house. The sightings continued. This was the first time that I saw these things, but certainly not the last. During a middle school sleepover, Ethan and a friend sat outside, chatting. There was another time that I had a friend over for a sleepover. Around the time I was in middle school, and we were sitting outside of my house just talking drama and whatever else that tween-age kids do. The friend, aware of Ethan's stories, saw something in the trees and stood ready to flee, but all of a sudden my friend saw something out in the trees. She heard all of my stories of these things before, so she stood up, ready to get out of there. Ethan thought it was an animal, but they watched, and a smaller, egg-shaped figure with a frowning porcelain mask appeared, moving from tree to tree, closer each time. I stood up with her anyway, and we watched the tree line a bit, waiting to see if we could spot it again. We waited and waited, and eventually a little head poked its way out from behind a tree. This one was much shorter than normal and more egg-shaped. Aaron, with his own white porcelain mask, this one had a frown, though, and he was peeking out from behind a tree at us, then went behind again. Then he moved to another tree and peeked at us again, all the while getting a bit closer. They ran inside, waking Ethan's mother, who found nothing. We were scared to move at first, but eventually ran inside, woke my mom, and told her everything that we had seen. She checked it out, but found nothing. The encounters persisted until the family moved to town when Ethan was 17, after which the sightings stopped. These kind of things went on for a long time, too, while I was growing up in that house, and eventually we moved out. We bought a house in the town about 15 minutes away, I would say, when I turned about 17 years old. Once we moved, these sightings mostly stopped. Years later, Ethan and his sister, newly licensed, visited the old house. But the last scare that they provided me happened when my sister and I went back out to visit our old home as teenagers. She had just gotten her license, you see. So, we drove out on a rainy day to see how everything was. Ethan shared a story about a girl he met in the cemetery who vanished after a strange noise. I was telling her all about a totally different story. And it was about a girl that I'd met in the cemetery once. We played and ran around, but a weird noise started coming from the woods. She wanted to see what it was, but I didn't want to wander off, so she went by herself. I waited, but she never came back. His sister stopped the car, shaken, admitting she saw the same figures and girl in the house during a fever. And eventually, midway through, she stopped the car and told me to stop. She was visibly upset, it seemed, and she then said, "You saw those things too?" I was pretty much flabbergasted. I figured that I was the only one that they were bothering. "Wait, you saw them too?" I questioned right back. She then told me about how she had seen not only them, but even the girl that I had described, but in our house. Apparently she was sick at the time. The forest wasn't just a backdrop, it was alive. Ethan found faint scratches on cemetery stones, not random, but patterned, glowing faintly under moonlight. Locals spoke of a forgotten cult, their masked figures guarding the land, their porcelain faces tied to rituals long buried. The girl, they said, was a sacrifice, her spirit bound to the masks, luring others. Ethan's dreams replayed her face, the masks' smiles and frowns shifting, their hum calling him back. The house, now abandoned, still stood, its land vibrating, waiting for someone new to play its game. Story number 11. The house was a fortress of familiar sounds, creaking floors, the hum of a distant TV, but tonight, it felt wrong. 8-year-old Caleb lay in bed, the darkness thick around him, his heart still heavy from his grandfather's death. The room was silent, but the air pulsed with a presence, as if something had followed him home from the funeral. His closet door, slightly ajar, seemed to breathe, its shadows shifting in ways the moonlight couldn't explain. Caleb's breath caught, his eyes fixed on the gap, certain something was watching. The closet creaked, and a figure emerged, tall, lanky, cloaked in an old duster and a wide-brimmed hat. It wasn't his grandfather, though it wore his shape, its eyes hidden in shadow, its presence cold and wrong. Caleb's chest tightened, his voice lost in fear as the figure stood motionless, its gaze a weight that pinned him to the bed. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body betrayed him, frozen under the shadow's silent stare. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was a violation, a stain on the room's safety. Caleb's tears came, hot and slut, as he clutched his blanket, praying for morning. The figure lingered, its hat tilting slightly, as if acknowledging his fear, then vanished into the dark. Caleb's sob broke the silence, a cry that brought his mother running, but the closet was empty. The night still, yet the air felt tainted, heavy with what had been there. His mother's voice was a comfort, but her explanation, a movie, ghosts seeping into his imagination, felt hollow. Caleb knew what he'd seen wasn't a dream, wasn't a film. It was real, and it had chosen him. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, its corners hiding eyes that watched when no one else could see. Caleb's sleep became a battle, his nights filled with the fear that the man would return, his hat casting shadows that never left. The next day, walking to soccer practice, Caleb saw him again, standing in a field, motionless, his duster flapping in the wind, his eyes hidden but fixed on him. The figure was too far to touch, too real to ignore. And Caleb ran, his heart pounding, knowing the shadow wasn't gone, only waiting. It followed him, not in footsteps, but in moments, appearing in mirrors, in doorways, a silent promise of something darker, something tied to the grief he couldn't shake. So, I was 8 years old when my grandpa passed away. The loss was a wound, raw and deep, for Caleb, who'd loved the rare visits to his grandfather's house, filled with holiday warmth. My grandpa was always in our lives, but he suffered from COPD from years of smoking, and we only saw him when we made the 2-hour drive to his house. So it was really only around things like Christmas and Thanksgiving. His death in that familiar house broke something in Caleb. When he died, I was at his house, too, and it was a really hard thing for me to go through. Even now, I struggle with death. Sometime before my grandpa passed away, my dad had watched 13 Ghosts on this sci-fi channel. This movie kind of freaked me out a bit. The film's ghosts, visible only through special glasses, haunted Caleb's young mind. But the figure he saw was different, more real. I saw him one night in my closet and I started crying. My mother chalked it up to me having watched 13 Ghosts and got mad at my dad for letting me watch it. She dismissed it, but Caleb knew the truth. Another one was when I was walking to soccer practice down the street and I saw this same figure or man standing out in the field just watching me. I saw this man several times over the period of about a month or so, and then after that, I never saw him again. The sighting stopped, but the fear lingered, a shadow that clung to Caleb's days. He avoided the closet, kept lights on, but the house felt changed, its walls holding secrets. Years passed, but the figure's gaze stayed with him, a memory that surfaced in quiet moments, a reminder of something he couldn't explain. Caleb grew, but the grief and the shadow were never far behind. Years later, in middle school, the shadow returned, not as a figure, but as something worse. Caleb, now 13, couldn't sleep, his mind restless. He slipped out of bed, seeking water, and stepped into the living room. I made my way to the living room, and when I entered, I noticed my sister sitting on the arm of the couch, facing the corner. Her name was Mary. "Mary, are you okay? What are you doing up?" I asked. Mary was still, her back to him, staring into the corner where the shadows pooled, thick and unnatural. She didn't respond, so I walked up to her and put my hand on her shoulder. The moment he touched her, a chill ran through him. And the moment that I touched her without looking back at me, my little sister responded in a way that scared me half to death. She growled and said, "Leave us alone." Her voice was wrong, deep and guttural, not her own, and the word "us" sent ice down Caleb's spine. This wasn't normal behavior for her at all, and the fact that she said "us" made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Caleb stumbled back, his heart racing, the room suddenly too small, too dark. I'd walked backwards, watching her on my way to my parents' room. I told my dad what happened, and he just kind of shrugged it off. His father, practical and dismissive, checked on Mary. He did walk out into the living room, though, wrangled my sister up off the couch and carried her to her room and put her back in bed. Mary seemed normal in the morning, unaware, but Caleb couldn't shake the image of her staring. The voice that wasn't hers. The house felt alive after that. Its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. Caleb began noticing things. Doors ajar, a faint smell of smoke like his grandfather's old cigarettes, a shadow that moved too slowly in the hall. He prayed, as his faith taught, but the words felt empty, powerless against the thing that had spoken through his sister. He told no one else, afraid of disbelief, but the memory burned, a warning that the shadow wasn't gone, only waiting. The shadow's reach grew. Caleb, now older, thought he'd left it behind, but had found his family again. I woke up one morning in the spring, and my dad and my little sister, they both looked like complete garbage. At the dining table, their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. I sat down and asked what was wrong. My dad was talking and visibly looked like he got no amount of sleep the past night. He spoke of a night he couldn't forget, and he began to tell us that he suffered from sleep paralysis for the first time in his life. He said that he had woken up lying flat on his back. He could only move his eyes, and looming above him when he opened his eyes was a dark, shadowy apparition. It was a man, tall, lanky, with a wide-brimmed hat. The figure hovered, its presence crushing, its eyes hidden but alive with malice. But it had apparently tried to scream and could only manage to get out muffled moans without his mouth actually opening. His mother woke, her voice pulling him free, but the fear lingered. My sister spoke up at this point when my dad finished talking and asked him what time this happened. Her voice trembled as she revealed her own terror. My parents asked her what was wrong, and she had the exact same thing happen to her, apparently that same night. But at 3:00 in the morning, the same apparition, same size, same hat. The room went still, the air thick with shared dread. Caleb's heart sank. The figure's image flooding back, tall, lanky, the hat casting shadows that hid its face. He saw it in his mind, standing in the closet, the field, now over his family, its presence a thread weaving through their lives. Caleb couldn't sleep for weeks, his faith shaken, his nights spent waiting for the shadow to return. He began researching, finding stories of entities that fed on grief, drawn to families broken by loss, their forms mimicking loved ones to gain trust. Caleb's belief in demons, rooted in his Christian faith, hardened, having put some thought into these encounters. I 100% believe that my family has had some sort of a demonic oppression that has flared up throughout the years. The figure wasn't his grandfather, but something darker, using his image to haunt them. I was able to physically see him. He influenced or possessed my sister as a child at one point, and then caused sleep paralysis on her and my father in the same night. The pattern was undeniable, a malevolent force that struck when they were vulnerable. The house became a battleground. Caleb prayed nightly, his Bible open, but the shadows lingered, moving in corners, whispering in the quiet. He found a photograph in the attic, old and faded, of his grandfather in a duster, but no hat, and burned it, hoping to sever the connection. His sister, Mary, began drawing dark figures with wide hats, her sketches trembling with fear. His father, once dismissive, now slept with a cross. his eyes skinning the dark for what he'd seen. Caleb sought a pastor who spoke of demonic oppression, of spirits that latched onto grief. A blessing was performed, the house filled with incense, but the air remained heavy, the shadow's presence a stain. Caleb moved out years later, but the figure followed in dreams, its hat casting shadows across his sleep. He avoided mirrors, kept lights on, but the fear was a scar, a reminder of the thing that had marked his family. Some nights, Caleb woke, certain he heard his grandfather's cough, faint and distant, but the house was empty. The shadow in the wide-brimmed hat was gone, but its weight lingered, a promise that it could return. Caleb lived on, his faith a shield, but the darkness was part of him now, a whisper in the quiet that never faded. Story number 12. The woods behind the YMCA were a wall of shadows, their darkness thicker than the city's glow could pierce. Eli, a 13-year-old caught in the chaos of a rough upbringing, lived on their edge, his house a stone's throw from their menace. The fenced, wooded area was notorious. Bodies had been found there, victims of the city's underbelly. Eli's neighbor, a devout Christian, warned of a demon born of the violence that stained the trees. Eli wasn't allowed to go there, but he did, using the woods as a shortcut, though never at night. Each step through the undergrowth brought dread, a feeling that something watched, waiting to claim him. The woods weren't just dark, they felt alive, their shadows crawling with intent. Eli's life was no refuge. His father, burdened by debt and worry, left him and his brother neglected. The neighbors' tales of a demon fed Eli's nightmares, where a black fog seeped from the trees, enveloping him, dragging him into the forest's heart. He woke sweating, the dreams relentless, haunting him for months. His father believed they were under attack, but Eli dismissed it as fear-mongering, until the night in the driveway changed everything. The city's lights couldn't reach the woods, and their darkness was a void, a malice that whispered his name. Eli and his father sat in their beat-up Volvo, arguing, their words sharp with frustration. The air was heavy, the night pressing against the car's windows. Eli's father said, "Every time we fight, we feed the thing in the woods." Eli scoffed, mocking the idea, his laughter a challenge to the unseen. Instantly, the car shook as something pounded the trunk, like fists hammering with fury. The blows were relentless, growing louder, and both screamed, clinging to each other, apologizing in desperation. As they spoke words of love, the pounding softened, then stopped, leaving only silence and their tears. The next morning, they found dents on the trunk, fist-shaped and deep, marks that hadn't been there before. The Volvo was old, battered, but these were new, a testament to the night's terror. Eli's father refused to speak of it, shutting down any mention, and they moved soon after. The wood remained a scar on Eli's memory, their evil undeniable. He tried to forget, but the dreams persisted, the fox pull a constant threat. The neighbors' warnings echoed. Violence had birthed something, and their anger had fed it. Eli's defiance, his cruel words, had been the spark, and the woods had answered with force. The new house was miles away, but the wood's shadow followed. Eli's father, worn by life, carried his own demons, but the forest's was different, tangible, vengeful. Eli avoided shortcuts, sticking to lit streets, but the city's bustle couldn't drown the memory of those blows. On X, he found stories of the woods, hikers who felt watched, teens who heard steps in the brush. One post mentioned a presence that thrived on conflict, growing stronger with every shout. Eli's nightmares shifted. The fog now had eyes, red and burning, watching from the trees. He wondered if his father's pain, their fights, had summoned it, or if it had always been there, waiting. Eli's brother, quieter but haunted, spoke once of hearing whispers on their old street, words that urged him to fight. The neighbor had moved too, her prayers unanswered, her warnings now a memory. Eli's curiosity grew. He wanted to return, to record the woods, to face the thing he'd mocked. But fear held him back. The dents, a warning etched in metal. The YMCA still stood, its fence rusted. The woods changed. Locals avoided them, their stories hushed, a missing camper, a scream in the night. Eli's father's death sealed the silence. He'd never speak of it, leaving Eli alone with the truth. Years later, Eli drove past the YMCA, the woods a dark line on the horizon. He lived 3 miles away, close enough to feel their pull, too scared to enter at night. The dreams had faded, but the dents remained in his mind, proof of something real. He believed the woods held evil, a force fed by pain and anger. On X, he shared his story, seeking others who'd felt the forest's wrath. Replies described footsteps, dread, and unseen things that struck in the dark. Some called it a demon, others a curse, but all agreed the woods were alive. Eli's heart urged him to record, to confront it, but his fear kept him away. The fury in the woods, a shadow he'd never escape. Story number 13. The forest was a sanctuary, its darkness a cloak for secrets no one dared to name. Elliot, alone on a midnight walk, felt the night shift, as if it knew he was there. A scent, animal and wrong, clung to the air, hinting at life where none should be. Then came the footsteps, steady on the gravel, leading him deeper into the unknown. But when they stopped, the silence screamed louder than any sound ever could. Elliot, a solitary soul in his late 20s, found solace in nighttime walks through the forest near his small town. He decided to go for a walk in the forest in his favorite clearing, a beautiful spot located on a hill with an amazing view over a field and off into the distance. The clearing, perched atop a hill, offered a breathtaking vista of fields stretching into the horizon, a place where he'd watched countless sunsets. He'd even watched a few sunsets there, and it has always been one of his go-to places. A campfire pit, occasionally used by others, sat at its center. There's also a campfire there, which seems to be used occasionally by other people. On this night, Elliot left his apartment under a starless sky, choosing to forgo a flashlight. The night was pitch black, but he chose not to use a light. He wanted the quiet, the warmth of the evening to envelop him undisturbed. Maybe he just didn't want to attract attention and preferred to enjoy the quiet warmth of the evening alone. As he walked, the forest silence was profound, broken only by his soft steps. The path wound past an old farm, its weathered barns looming in the dark. He passed an old farm next to the road leading to the clearing. He'd seen it countless times, always empty, abandoned. He had passed that farm many times before and had never seen any animals, people, or cars around it. But tonight, a sharp, musky scent hit him. unmistakably animal. An unmistakable farm animal smell hit him, something that he had never experienced there before. The scent was jarring, a thick, earthy musk that didn't belong. It was that sort of typical earthy, musky scent that you get when animals are around. Elliot scanned the darkness, expecting to see a stray cow or horse, but the farm was as lifeless as ever. Instinctively, he looked around and hoping to spot something in the darkness, but just as always, the place was completely empty. The smell lingered, heavy and unnatural, as if the air itself carried a memory of life long gone. No animals, no signs of life, nothing except the strong smell lingering in the air, shrugging it off. Elliot continued to the clearing, his unease a faint whisper in his mind. He found that a bit strange, but shook it off and continued walking. At the clearing, he settled by the campfire pit, its ashes hiding glowing embers. When he inspected the campfire, he noticed that beneath the ash there were some embers still glowing. A stack of firewood lay nearby, left by previous visitors. There was also firewood stack nearby, left by whoever had been there before. Elliot rekindled the fire, its warm light pushing back the dark. He decided to rekindle the fire using the leftover wood lying on the grass. He gazed at the stars, the sky a vast canvas of light. Soon he was lying on the ground next to it, stargazing and watching up in the night sky. For hours, the peace held him, the crackle of the fire his only companion. For a couple of hours, he enjoyed the peaceful night. The forest felt like a world apart, its silence a gift, until the firewood ran out and the fire faded to ash. As the last embers died, the darkness reclaimed the clearing, the moon too dim to offer light. He ran out of firewood and didn't feel like venturing into the woods for more, so let the fire die out and allowed himself to drift into the quiet darkness. Elliot lay still, savoring the quiet, when a sound shattered the calm. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, on the gravel road. Suddenly, he heard footsteps coming toward him from the gravel road, loud and distinct in the silent night. The fire was gone, the night near impenetrable. The fire had burned out completely, and the moon was dim, leaving everything in near total darkness. He couldn't see the source, nor could they see him, hidden in the shadows. At this stage, he couldn't see them, and obviously they couldn't see him. Lying low, Elliot listened, tracking the steps by sound alone. As he lay there on the ground, hidden by the darkness, he listened closely and tracked their movement by sound alone. Curiosity overtook fear, and he rose, following the unseen walker. As the footsteps passed him, he got up and started following them. It felt natural. They were heading toward his town, a coincidence of paths. It wasn't strange to him at the time. He was heading home, and they just so happened to be going in the same direction toward his town. He stayed back, his steps soft, aware of his advantage. He felt a strange sense of advantage that they didn't know that he was there, but he knew about them. The gravel shifted under his feet, mingling with the stranger's steady pace. Their footsteps remained steady, and he could hear his own footfalls joining theirs. But then, without reason, the footsteps ahead stopped, swallowed by silence. All of a sudden, without warning, their footsteps just vanished. Elliot froze, confusion giving way to unease. He stopped confused. He continued walking, passing the farm again, its musky scent now fainter but still present. He continued down the road, passing the farm again. Something felt wrong, so he paused, turning to face the darkness. Something nagged at him, so he paused, turned around, and waited, expecting to see someone emerge from the darkness behind him. He waited, eyes straining, ears alert for any sound, a rustle, a step, anything. He stood there for quite some time, staring into the darkness, waiting for a moment, a sound, anything. But the forest was silent, unnaturally so. There was nothing, no footsteps, no rustling in the trees, no sign of anyone. The absence gnawed at him. That's really when he became unsettled the most. If it was a person, they hadn't known he was following. His steps could have startled them, prompting them to hide. If it had been a person walking ahead of him, they wouldn't have known that he was there. But hiding would make noise, branches breaking, leaves shifting. If they had jumped off the road onto the forest to hide or escape, there should have been some noise. There was none. There was nothing. The next day, Elliot returned, the clearing bathed in daylight. The next day, when he went back, he could clearly see his footsteps. His shoe prints marked the gravel, clear and solitary. You could see the imprint of a shoe and all, but there were no other footprints anywhere, no other tracks, no sign of another soul. The forest, the farm, the footsteps, they formed a puzzle with no answer, a night that lingered in Elliot's mind, whispering of something that walked but left no trace.